structure of my presentation, beyond this introduction, is I want to look at a definition of spatial planning, and I want to pose the question with you, is this simply new language to describe old ideas? I then want to look at a bit of history, to look at some well-known precedents about strategic spatial thinking. And this is going to lead me on to thinking about doing a bit of brainstorming and thinking about developing a vocabulary of spatial concepts that we might find in our plans. I'm then going to use those spatial concepts to analyse some plans that were made in the past, but also one plan that's been made very recently. So I'm going to be looking at 3 case studies. And then very briefly at the end, I'm going to make some comparisons and draw some conclusions. So the first thing I'm going to consider is spatial planning. What does it mean? And I came across a definition which is widely adopted. It talks about spatial planning being more than traditional land use planning. It's about integrating policies for the development and use of land, but integrating them with other policies and programs, not necessarily to do with land directly. So that's a fairly typical definition. But I was struck when I came to look at a much earlier definition of something we call structure planning. This was right at the very beginning of my own professional career. We talked about structure planning a lot. And when I set these 2 definitions beside one another, I was struck by how they were. They were both talking about planning being more than land use planning. They were talking about influencing things in other spheres of policy. So this led me to be suspicious that perhaps we were being sold some new language. Really our thinking had not moved on. So I thought, well, if it's not really different, perhaps it's going to be more spatial. And so I thought, well, I'd make the theme of my talk today to explore that particular possibility. So, I like to go back and look at history quite a lot, and here is some familiar history to many people who know anything about planning. It's Ebenezer Howard, writing at the end of the 19th century, drawing a distinction, a magnet, 3 magnets, town, country, and his question in the middle, the people, where will they go? And his suggestion was that perhaps we should take the emphasis off towns, take the emphasis off country, but concentrate on something that combined the best of both, that he called town and country. He went on to develop this as a spatial concept. He talked about mixed uses, medium densities, fixed size development, jobs, etc., all within walking distance. He set a population size. He talked about combinations of garden cities linked by a rapid transit system. And it was interesting when I came to look at Ebenezer Howard to see that somebody had repeated the 3 magnets argument 100 years later, trying really to translate it into terms that we'd understand in the late 20th and early 21st century. I was also drawn to the writings of Patrick Abercrombie, who wrote a textbook in 1933. And one of the most interesting diagrams in that textbook is called 5 Town Silhouettes. It starts off by looking at a typical English town, takes us through garden cities, looks at a continental town, thinks about a future city, this is in the 1930s, and throws in Le Corbusier's town as a final afterthought there. And what he does is to think about spatial organisation, to think about density, to think about how is a city defined in some quite provocative ways. Again, showing the ability to think in the abstract about how cities are organised. So, in my mission to think about spatial concepts, I did some brainstorming. I came up with a whole series of ideas that might be present in some of these spatial plans, and wouldn't it be worth looking out for them? So these were some of the ideas that I came up with, just perhaps spending an hour or 2 just thinking about the sort of things that I might expect to find in plans. So these were some of the ideas, but I sought to organise them. And I thought, in fact, that my list could be divided into 3 sections. One of them talks specifically about the context of strategic planning, things like functional geography, which we've heard about already today, spatial distribution, spatial dynamics. And then there were spatial concepts that were used in policy instruments themselves. The whole question of location, co-location, spatial connectivity, spatial organisation, spatial form, all of which at various times might be expected to form policy instruments. And then thirdly and finally, concepts that describe the spatial outcomes of policy. So questions of equity, spatial equity, spillover effects, spatial convergence, spatial vision. Functional geography, the classic application of this is in thinking about city regions. A concept that's by no means new, and looking at my own area of Liverpool and Merseyside, it's been talked about many, many times over the last 70 years. Quite interestingly described here as the economic footprint of an area, which I think is quite a good distilled definition. So, if we then move on to think about using these spatial concepts to analyse plans, what happens? I'm going to look at three case studies, one from the 1940s, one from 1965, and one from the present day, 2012. Liverpool, northwest of England, I think a lot of people are familiar with it as a city. All my three plans apply either to the city itself or to the surrounding city region and the city. This is the earliest plan I'm going to look at, from the 1940s. And this was prepared during the wartime for the city as it would emerge from the war. The big problem seen in those days was the question of reducing the level of congestion in the centre of the conurbation. So planning was about decentralisation of population and employment, what would have been called at the time overspill. Notice how the city is divided into a series of zones from this density perspective. This is what the plan itself looked like. This is some of the analysis. It's quite interesting that in the 1940s plan, they were looking at corridors of movement and their relationship with land use activities. So there was some land use transportation going on at the time. This diagram took my fancy because it's talking about journey to work flows, commuting flows. Prepared in 1944, the latest data available at the time was 1921, when I imagine that people were getting to work by horse and cart rather than by car. But it does show an interesting level of analysis that perhaps I wouldn't have expected from the mid-1940s. My second case study is from the mid-1960s, when we were very active in talking about strategic planning. And in the 1960s, certainly in Britain, there was no shortage of proposals for revised infrastructure. High levels of investment in housing and infrastructure. This map shows some of the possibilities here. It's showing industry offices, it's showing barrages, it's showing motorway networks, it's showing new towns and so on. Whoops. Down here. Right. Yeah, so they came up with an interim policy statement, which was a kind of pioneering document in terms of the structure planning I was talking about. You also got this spatial categorization applied to industry and residential areas. And you got the idea of spatial form, the idea of actually distilling the city into an abstract version, looking at the major land uses, and comparing it with other cities like Manchester and Birmingham at the same time. City centre, the subject to separate planning, but at least an abstraction here. And here, thinking about different densities as you move from the centre of the city region, the existing profile, the profile as it appeared in development plans, the suggested future distribution of density, thinking about that as a planning tool, a spatial planning tool. And then thinking about the urban form, the spatial form, thinking about alternative configurations in an effort to accommodate growth, and coming up eventually with something called a finger plan down in the right-hand corner there for future urban development over the following 20 or 25 years. Third example from 2012, Liverpool Core Strategy, a document prepared just in the last few months, making extensive use of spatial distribution maps. Here is a map of multiple deprivation, social deprivation, but using maps as a form of analysis in terms of setting the context for the plan. The plan itself, again using this question of categorizing areas, an inner area, city centre area, an area surrounding that, and an area beyond that, with different policies actually addressed to those different types of geographical area. A spatial vision, what I've outlined in red there, are all the various references to things that are spatial in that document. So it goes on, and there's a second page. I'm not going to focus on the details, there isn't time. But the spatial vision being one way in which the idea of spatial concepts are translated into planning form. And looking at spatial alternatives in terms of the particular approach taken to regeneration and to new development. This is one of 3 options that were looked at within the plan. So, those were my 3 case studies. What came out of it? Along the top of this slide are the 3 plans that we've been looking at. The first slide looks at the question of context and the extent to which the plans themselves were either looking at functional geography, spatial distribution, spatial dynamics. All of them, to some degree, looked at functional geography. They varied enormously as to how much notice they took of spatial distributions, with more emphasis on the most recent plan. And none of them really paid much attention to how things had been changing in a spatial sense. That wasn't a feature of any of the plans from whatever period. This is looking at the second of the 3 categories, the idea of policy instruments, and looking at the extent to which they embodied spatial concepts. The interesting thing that came out of that was that the 1960s plan was the one that made the most creative use of those spatial concepts. It certainly wasn't a very strong feature of the most recent plan, so it rather makes my point that perhaps these recent spatial plans aren't any more spatial than what we've been used to in the past. And then finally, in terms of spatial outcomes, the spatial vision, particularly featuring in my 3rd plan, but also in the other 2, with virtually no attention to things like spillover effects and spatial convergence. Some emphasis on spatial equity in the most recent plan, but not in either of the 2 earlier plans. So, I think it is a worthwhile exercise to analyse plans. It's something I've been interested in for some time. In this particular case, what I've done is to show rather crudely how you can look at plans from the point of view of their spatial content. I think my list of spatial concepts is a first start. It could be added to, other people would have other opinions. But I think nevertheless, the overall approach, the analytical framework I've talked about, is one that I think is capable of being applied more widely, and certainly well beyond the British context that I've talked about this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.